I'm Andrea Immer Robinson, and I'm a master sommelier. Exploring wine and food is my passion, and it's my life's work. As a wine and food book author, TV host, trained chef, and educator, it's my privilege to share with you the fun, people, and places, and the delicious pairings that make our lives and our planet a better place. Welcome to Quench from my home in wine country. Well, hello everybody and welcome to Quench. Of course, it's summer down under, right? So I had to put on my shades. It's great to have you all with us, and we've had a little bit of technical difficulty here at the last minute, so hope everybody's hearing us well, and maybe one of my good buddy peeps will, who's watching live, will text me if you're having any audio issues, but I think we're good. So great to be with everybody. We're celebrating the fact that it's summer down under in January, and it's also, as you're gonna learn very shortly, harvest season, which is super cool. Before we get started though, I want to just give my thoughts, and I know you all feel the same, to our friends and neighbors in Southern California and the Los Angeles area. I don't think anybody other than us here in the Napa Valley or our Australian friends could be more empathetic and aware of what you're going through. And we're thinking about you and we're praying for you. If you are a pray person, do that. If you're a karma person, whatever it is, we will be well. I got just the news from my buddy Vicky that the sound's good, so thank you, my darling. She's a dear friend, and I appreciate that very much. But we're thinking of you, and we will be here for you. I've got family members and close friends who left yesterday in their fire trucks to head your way, and they will be helping out, and that makes me feel great. So I'll be praying for them and all of you, and it's just great to have you with us here tonight. Let's get started. We've got a fantastic show, but I first want to talk a little bit about the last show, because we had we're first of all going to spill the jaywalk rye. It's live TV, folks. You are easing the cork out, not pulling it out unless you're at the World Series and you won. Right? And then we're looking for just like a hiss or a cough or a sigh. And
we did it.
We should do this for a living. All right, as you can see, live TV always has its fun times, but I was making cocktails for the holidays, and also with my great friend Kelly White, author of Wine Confident. We were teaching everybody how to open champagne and sparkling wine safely for the holidays and for every day. As far as I'm concerned, any day is a day for sparkling wine. Sometimes it's kind of what makes the day. And so as the Valentine's season comes up, I hope you'll check that video out. It was kind of hilarious. But the sparkling wine part of it went really well, as you could see from that last little clip. Tonight, our show is really special, though, because what we're celebrating is what makes Australia an inimitable wine region. It's a newbie, a young and on the block, kind of like us here in the United States, really getting started in the 1800s for all intents and purposes. And it's therefore quite interesting and exciting that it has so many wines that are distinctive and like no other compared to any other wines in the world. They're based on classical European grapes, just like our classic wines here in the U.S., although there's some great domestic wines and some great hybrid varieties. But the classic European grapes are the ones that we really all consider our go-tos. Australia has taken them and done something interesting and special, and there's also some particular stylistic things that are so worth pursuing because they over-deliver for the price, but they're also going to give you a taste experience that's like nothing else. There's a lot of reasons for that. We're going to get into it, but we've got tonight one of those. We're going to start with one of my favorite styles in the world because it ages well, but yet you don't have to pay an arm and a leg for it. And this is a Hunter Valley Semillon. We're going to be, I call it sip or cellar, because you can do both. You can drink them young and it's kind of like Albarino without the saltiness, or you can wait until they're bottle aged and just kind of have an out-of-body experience. So we're going to do that tonight. We're also going to be talking to Mark Davidson, who's a fellow sommelier advanced psalm in the court, author of The Wines of Australia. He's the educator for Wine Australia for the U.S. And I really hope at some point after tonight you'll make a point to go to an event that he hosts or something like that. You're going to learn a ton, but it's also a bunch of fun to hang out with him. And that book is killer. And when I was putting this together, I picked my sort of 4. These are the go-to styles that we needed to do. Then I looked in the book and he was like, these are the wines from Australia that you need to taste right now. So I was like, we're aligned. We've also got Gavin Spate, who is with Old Bridge Cellars, which is one of the really great original artisanal wine importers that focusing on especially Australian wines. They have some great stuff from New Zealand as well. But of course, tonight's talk is about Australia, and he's just a ton of fun. I'm going to be giving some lightning round assignments to my guests here to talk about their favorite food pairings. We're also going to taste a Judgment of Napa Chardonnay winner. And you wouldn't necessarily think, oh, Australia was going to beat out the greatest California Chardonnays and the greatest French Burgundies. We're going to taste one that actually did. And I'm not surprised, but most people really were on that day. It just goes to show you that great, great classic wine can be made everywhere. And then we're going to taste an Old Vine Shiraz, which is really such a signature of the country. Old vines in general are a signature of the country, and you may be wondering why. We'll talk about more about that. And then finally, a dessert wine, a sticky, and we just do need to get the Australians to explain how to speak Australian to us tonight. So we're going to find out why they call them stickies. I think we probably know. But it's a spectacular wine that you kind of need to have sooner rather than later. After all, Valentine's Day is coming up, so if you're a chocolate person, here we go. So I'm going to jump in here, though, and just take us really quick to the map of Australia, because what you're going to see is that when it comes to Australia, it's like every other great classic wine country in that the grapevines are planted in places where climate moderating influences exist. So in this case, you can see, this is a great map that Mark provided from Wine Australia. You can see that this is all of the great wine regions are concentrated around the coast, sometimes in mountain ranges, because what you get with either coastal influence or a great big river or maybe elevation from mountains is you get moderation of climate. And classic grape varieties love, love, love to have moderate climates because that's how they have long growing seasons and the ability to get the balance, the fruit, but also the acid that you want. Because really what makes wine a food partner is the acidity. It makes your mouth water, it makes food taste better, and that's what's good stuff. So now what we're going to do is jump in with our first guest. I've got Chris Tyrrell. Now, I know you know it's February 8th here in North America.
January.
In California. Excuse me, January. Thank you, Chris. You would think I've already been drinking the wine, but it is tomorrow, so it's January 9th, and it's lunchtime in the at Tyrrell's Winery. So, Chris, welcome to the show. First of all, what's going on? I think you've got a harvest underway.
We do, but I'm just taking some time out to read my book from Mark.
Good job. No, excellent.
We're in our 4th day of harvest for the 2025 vintage, and last year was the earliest vintage in my lifetime. So the earliest vintage since 1981, but I wasn't alive then, so that's okay. But this year we beat it by 2 days. We started on the 6th, which was in a good omen, my mother's birthday, which has never happened. So it's probably a good thing, right? Start on mum's birthday.
Oh, fantastic. It's my son's birthday too. That's cool.
Yeah.
So you're harvesting what right now? And show me, you've brought a little bit of the ferment in with you. How's it tasting?
Yeah. So we started, this week we've been what we would call in Australia scratching around. Not really busy yet, just sort of doing some things. We did all of we did the sparkling base yesterday. We picked our super early Chardonnay block that we pick every year. But today we actually picked our first Semillon. So from our old vines planted in 1911. And you can see on the camera here, so that was picked by hand from about 6 a.m. this morning. They finished at about 10, and then we've literally just pressed that. So you can see there it's quite cloudy and looks a bit funky on the screen, but that's okay. So that
it
will
looks
settle
beautiful.
So that's from a really old vineyard planted in 1911, which we call Stevens, and we do an individual bottling of. So super old vines, and I'm sure we can talk about this later, but from pre-phylloxera, first generation material from France, which is one of the great things about Australia. And yeah, that'll be into ferment probably tomorrow afternoon, and then we're away. But I'd imagine next week we'll get very busy here. So yeah.
That's amazing. So actually, let's take a look at what we're tasting tonight, because this is the Tyrrell's, the wait, hold on, HVD, HVD.
Yeah.
And what's cool about this, I just tasted, thank you for providing the regular Hunter Valley, which is 2023 vintage. And I'm just reminding people that, yes, those wines are on the market right now because their harvest is 6 months before us in the States. And it's delicious. And it really got me excited about going by the grocery store and getting some sushi. But the HVD, this is the bottle aged. And so let's talk about that. This is a style of wine that is so unusual and so special in that it gets better with age. How is that? Why is that? There's not oak on this wine as far as I know. It's really, it's very hands-off. But can you explain why these wines get better with age?
Yeah, firstly, wow. I usually interrupt people, Andrew, and say it's a style of wine that, and then I interrupt and say that accountants usually hate because we have so many years of it in our warehouse. But no, look, that's right. Semillon is this amazing thing, and where when they're youngsters, I call them, they're bright and fresh and zesty. And you mentioned you just had the Hunter Valley blend, but that's the only one that we actually release as a youngster. All of our single vineyard bottlings and our flagship VAT one, which I've got here, we keep them for a minimum of 6 years, and we think that they just take on weight, they take on complexity, they take on interest. They've just become, to put it bluntly, they just become a lot better. And we think that's when the wine really expresses itself, and we're sort of doing the work for the customer. And I think at 6 years of age, it's still a really good each way bet, where I think you're getting a hint of development on the nose and a bit of development on the palate, but they're still so lively and vibrant and fresh and bright and all those great things. It really is a good, you get the best of both worlds.
I totally agree. I'm going to give some words for people for what we mean by development right now, because you still have this beautiful, almost like lemon curd or key lime pie or lemon meringue pie filling. But then you also have the meringue part, which is kind of the toasty. And then you also have, this is me growing up in the South, the graham cracker crust, that toasty thing. Those are the elements, the caramelized elements that come along with development. There's also a little bit of like a kind of a honey and a waxy. It's just absolutely beautiful. If they could make a candle with this fragrance, then they'd probably charge whatever that fancy diptyque would charge, like $90 for the candle of it or something. But that is so delicious. Okay, so I'm going to give you a quick assignment here, because I'm thinking of all kinds of things. I have this beautiful aged Gouda cheese in front of me, although my cheese monger friends say it's Gouda. So how do you say Gouda? You say it Gouda. But anyway, what is your favorite pairing with a wine like this?
You mentioned it before, and I think here in Australia, we're so lucky that our proximity to Southeast Asia. So we've got all these amazing Asian influences in our cuisines, and there's so much good seafood here in Australia. But for me, there's a couple. I think when they're bright and fresh, the Hunter Valley blend, which you had, the youngster, I think fresh oysters, Sydney rock oysters, which are indigenous to the coastline where we're very close to here, is perfect. But then as they get older, and like the one you have there, for me it's like just richer seafood things, So just nice pieces of fleshy fish. It'd be lovely if we could all eat lobster every day, but we can't, obviously. Right. But just I think as they get older and develop more flavors, I end up being the richer sort of seafoods, and to me, it's perfect.
100%, I think so. And I did French culinary school years ago, and I remember the first time I made beurre noisette, which is basically browned butter, where you just let the solids brown. That is exactly what I want with this, and it makes me think of this Northeast specialty that I haven't had in years, shad roe, or we do here in the Bay Area when we're lucky enough to have friends who will go diving for abalone in the right season. Pounded abalone with browned butter and a little panko, be perfect. So let's just real quick before we move on, I want to talk about the old vines, and you gave me this fantastic photograph. Why old vines? What's important about it? I mean, I know, but I want to hear it from you.
Yeah, we get asked all the time what is special about an old vine, And I think there's two parts to that story. I think one of the things that I love about old vines, and I think one of the huge advantages is when people talk, when winemakers and grape growers talk about vintage variation, whether it's a hot year or a cold year, I think to me, what old vines do is they compress those peaks and troughs. So in the really hot years, it handles the conditions a lot better than a young vineyard. And in the years where it might be a bit more disease pressure or colder, they ripen a bit more evenly. They're just tougher and more mature. They're like humans, right? Like when I
Right.
was an adolescent, I was, not a fun person to be around. I think I'm a bit better now. I'm a bit older.
And now
But
you're
to me, I think,
interesting, you're complicated,
yeah, that's
you've got a
right.
lot
That's
to
right.
say in a few
I'm
words.
complicated, all right. But no, and then I think the other thing about old vines as well is there is a thing to that where I think it's about the site as well. And the reason that it becomes an old vine is because grape growers, 100 years ago, they would have liked it, would have cropped well, it would have tasted well, it would have made good wine, so they left it in there. And we've got lots of spots here where they've had vineyards and now they're not there. And I think sometimes it's great old sites make great wines, not great old vines necessarily. I think there's a lot to
Right.
that.
It's like we don't want to cut down those marquee trees. And I think that
No.
people have to realize it is a commitment, to your point about wines that accountants don't like, because as the vines get older, I'm sure they yield less, but they yield better. And that's
Not
what we're
always
looking
though.
for.
You'd be really shocked to know our old
Right.
vines are some of our biggest yielding because the root system's so deep they can access the water. So none of our vines here have any irrigation, which is a big thing in a lot of parts of the world. But ours are all
Absolutely.
dry grown. You can see in that photo there. Yeah, so all these
Beautiful.
dry growing vineyards with amazingly complex deep root systems which can access water, nutrients, all those things. Yeah.
They just take care of themselves. I've heard the same thing from Prue Henschke, that the old
Yeah.
vines are actually the most established and stable because they're just taking care of themselves. And as you said, from the root
Yeah.
penetration.
Yeah.
I want to wrap up with you with one final thing, because I think that, and I'm going to get Mark Davidson, who's my guest, coming on here in a second to talk about exactly what this means. But you have the Australian Wine Sustainability Certification, and I know one of the biggest areas that you've been focusing on is one that I think people should know about, which is the bottle weight, because a lot of the studies have shown that between 40 and 60% of the carbon footprint of wine production is the glass bottle, both producing it in the furnaces, but then shipping it, filling it, and the weight of that. So you guys have really been focused on that a lot. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is, and I think I don't want to touch on other people's business necessarily, but I think there is a bit of marketing and ego around the bottle selection, right?
Feel
But
free to
something
touch
for us,
on it. I think we have to realize that what's in the bottle is more
yeah,
important than how much the package weighs. I'm down for
and
that.
like
I'll be the one to
it's
say
in,
that.
it's interesting. I've never had a customer, and we've always been in what would be called a lightweight bottle now, but never in my life I've ever had a customer pick up a bottle of VAT one and say, that wine's amazing, but shit, I wish it was in a heavier bottle. It'd make it better.
Right.
No one ever says that, right? And I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
so. To us, it's never been an issue. And what we're actually working on now is some of our more commercial wines, like that Hunter blend you've got there, that Hunter Valley
Right.
Semillon, the area blend
Yep.
is how can we even shave a bit more off that? So
Right.
I think it's a 416 gram bottle,
Wow, that's
and
impressive.
the bottle that the VAT one's in is I think 480 or something. So they're light, And I had a bottle of a very expensive Burgundian wine in the tens of thousands a bottle, and that would have been a 1 kilo bottle. Like,
Right.
and
Yeah,
once you get
it's
to a certain point, do you even need it? I don't know. I don't think so. But I
yeah,
think it's
and
the easy one to start with. Glass is easy, right?
absolutely. And for sommeliers, for retailers, like why something extra heavy to carry around, all of those things. So this is I'll be the one to say, vote with your wallet and support light bottles, because if people think that we care about how much the bottle weighs, then they're going to be afraid that we won't buy their wine. So Chris, thank you so much. This is absolutely delicious, and I'm dying to do some burn noisette, but we got the rest of the show to do. So happy harvest to you. Thanks for joining, and
Thank
you're
you.
probably hungry now, and it's lunchtime where you are. So
Well,
again, I look forward to seeing you here in the States, and thank you for
yeah.
sharing, and all best wishes for the rest of this fantastic 2025 harvest for you guys.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me, and yeah, look forward to seeing you stateside soon.
All right. Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Brent. Bye.
So that was incredibly fun, and I'm now going to bring in, though, my next guest. Well, two guests. I've got a couple coming up here. So we've got Gavin Spate from Old Bridge Cellars, and I just poured the Broken Wood
The
2017 Semillon
this one,
because
you've seen
we've
that
had an
one.
18,
Yeah.
now a 17, and same thing. And what I love about this is that these are both wines that are, if you are a little bit resourceful, they're pretty well available in the United States. But this is just delicious. It's almost like there's a floral element to it as well.
Yeah. I think Broken Wood down in the Lower Hunter there, they always very mean soils, and the wines are always quite uplifting. I think this is caught in the beautiful cusp. It's got that energy of the youthful lemon curdy, but
Yes.
it's got a little bit of that sort of the secondary characters.
A little
through.
bit
It
of
hasn't
the-
gone too far to the sort of the we call it buttered toast and things like that.
Yeah,
down
which
there.
nothing wrong with buttered toast, but that's the whole thing, is to be able to watch the progression, and it's wonderful to be able to get it with already this bottle age, but then you can also put it in your cellar. And I just read an article by a writer that everybody loves, Andrea Robinson. She's fantastic, and they did a big tasting and ultimately showed that screw caps were one of the best closures for aging
Correct,
wine.
yeah.
And that's not something that people have been thinking about for a long time. So it's a pretty cool thing. So let me jump into, though, and introduce Mark Davidson. And hopefully, Mark, you can hear me now. We had a little bit of a technical issue, but how are those headphones?
Yeah, I put on the big, clunky, goofy ones because they seem to be working. My other professional TV presenter ones didn't seem to work. So
You're really good at mocking up that Australian accent. How'd you pull that off? Oh, wait. Where are you from?
yeah, I did grow up in Australia actually. So there you have it. But yeah, I've been living here for quite some time. But great to be here and amongst a few legends. Chris Tyrrell, the Tyrrell's family, one of my favorite producers in Australia to talk about at any given point just because of what they do. And Gavin Spate, who's been bringing in great wines into the US through Old Bridge Cellars for the better part of 20 years, if not a bit longer than 20 years. So yeah, fun to be here.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, first of all, so I know that you're an ex or a recovering sommelier,
Lapsed.
right? Lapsed
Lapsed.
sommelier, that's the word. Okay, so where were you working as a sommelier? I know this,
All
but I
over
want
the
you to
place.
tell people about you. Okay.
I worked mostly in, I did hospitality school in Australia in the 1970s, but that's a long time ago. And then I was always in restaurants throughout my entire career, went more front of the house, did my sommelier training. I didn't do it through the court actually because the court
good.
in those days wasn't actually relevant, not because it wasn't good, but it just wasn't available in the 80s.
Wasn't available
So I did
there,
different
yeah.
studies. Yeah. And then I was in Canada, so I worked in Toronto for some time and quite a long time in Vancouver where I set up a wine school. And so the vast majority of my sommelier experience ended up in Canada, started in Australia, ended up in Canada. And then I taught classes through what was the International Sommelier Guild in various parts of the US, Canada. and all
That's
over
what
the
it
place.
is,
So,
the guild,
yeah.
that's right. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, you've been hard at work on a fantastic book, The Wines of Australia, from the Académie de Vin Library Press. And I think I really love this book. I think that it's very, very comprehensive without being enormous and a lot to get through. To me, this is kind of the handbook because you can quickly get to what you want to know, but it also reads really well and it explains all of the geeky stuff, but in really concise, crisp terminology. Was this a big project to get done?
Yeah, I'd never written a book before, and many of my friends said, "Damn, I can't believe you actually did that." But it had to be compact and concise simply because that was what was required. Because the Classic Wine Library, which is what I started with, and then it got taken over by Académie de Vin, which I was thrilled about because my first few wine books I ever bought were Stephen Spurrier's books on France, and that was Académie de Vin. So I'm thrilled to be in that same company. But
In the stable, yeah.
at the same time that Wines of Australia was published, so were the Wines of Piedmont, and they're exactly the same size. So
Wow.
Piedmont gets the same space. We all had the same amount of space, which initially,
Oh my goodness. One
Well,
small region,
interesting.
Piedmont, gets the same size as,
Yeah.
as
Which
the whole
is-
country.
which is
continent.
interesting, but in a way, I didn't like it at first, and I was a bit annoyed by the how compact. But I liked the fact that it made me you had to get rid of stuff that maybe wasn't relevant. You've got to look at the series. It's called The Wines of Australia. It's about the wines and the producers with background information to set the scene. And I like that. So once I got into the flow of it, I loved it. But yeah, I think anyone that's written a book will never say that, oh my God, I love doing that. You'd love finishing it, but there are points at which, I mean, before getting going on the book, I don't think my house has ever been so clean because I found all sorts of reasons not to write. But once I got into it, it was great. And actually, I did really enjoy it. But yeah, it's not an easy thing to do. And you finish it and you're thrilled about certain parts. There's other parts I think, oh, I wouldn't mind changing that. And other parts you go, damn, I can't believe I wrote that. That's really good. So it's a bit of a a bit of a dichotomy, but yeah, it's fun.
Well, I'm going to give a shout out also to our friends Jane Lopes and Jonathan Ross and their book,
Another
How to
great book.
Drink Australian. This, on the other hand, this is, to me, is sort of like the Kermit Lynch,
Travels
kind
on the
of
wine route.
travels on the wine route type book where it's really very much about their personal connection to the people and the places. It's spectacular. It's a big, big, big book, though. So I'm glad they're still married. That is a huge project. But two great sommeliers, and now they're importing some great Australian wines as well. And I just wanted to mention that one. But let's jump into this incredible wine that we're going to taste now. And I'm going to let you guys, first of all, say hello. I know you can't hear them
I
because you
can't
don't
hear
have...
you, Mark. But Mark and I talk a lot, so I know what you sound like.
Yeah.
It's okay. You sound like me. You've got the similar accent, I think.
And the
I
reason
love
we
I
have
love
to...
showing up to Old Bridge Cellars whenever I'm in Napa, and I'll be there in a few weeks doing the IMW stuff again. But if you get at like 4 or 5 o'clock at Old Bridge Cellars is the best time to go. Andrew, this is for you because Gavin will go, oh, it's the end of the day. Let's open some old wine. So
Let's open
he
some
can't
old
hear that,
wine
but-
and bring in some state line barbecue from
Yeah.
down the
Did he
road.
really say that? I'm lip reading wrong.
Yeah,
Did he really say
he did really say that. Yes, exactly.
kidding.
But you always have to kind of check in on the product, do some inventory
That's
analysis
right, yeah,
and checking.
we have fun.
very
so-
important.
So we're going to move into a really world-class wine, and I think that this was on every wine list that I ever either wrote or worked with at Windows on the World. This is a wine that's been around for a long time, and but this is the Lewin,
Lewin, correct?
Lewin Estate Chardonnay, and we're gonna talk a little bit about kind of what it means. But Mark, if you can just tell a little bit about kind of how it came to be, because this has an interesting California connection that I think many people don't know about, but it really captures sort of the entrepreneurial spirit and the frontier element of this region of Australia, Western Australia. So can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Margaret River. This is the story, and there's a few versions of this. This is what was told to me by Trish, the owners, like Trish and David. They just. I'll tell her version of it. So she said, basically, Dennis, her husband, bought a property in Margaret River. They were chartered accountants up in Perth, but they had this property down in Margaret River. Ostensibly, she thought because Dennis wanted to go down and surf mostly, because there's brilliant surfing in Margaret River. And then they had this property, and at one point there were these people walking on the property, surveying it and having a look, and they were like, well, who was it? It was Mondavi and a bunch of people, and they were like, what are you doing here? Well, we'd like to buy it. Well, why do you want to buy it? Well, we think it'd be a great place for Chardonnay. They said, well, we don't want to sell. We don't want to sell it, but this is curious. I tell you what, why don't we commission you to sort of help us? We'll do this. We'll start this project. We think that's kind of interesting. And they became really good friends, and he was absolutely spot on. It was a brilliant place for Chardonnay, which is interesting because the region itself was initially dictated as a region based on some studies done by a guy called John Gladstone that was saying, hey, gravelly soils, mild maritime climate, suitability of Cabernet and the Bordeaux varieties, which it absolutely is.
100%.
Yet Mondavi was the genius that said, hey, pay attention to Chardonnay, and he was absolutely right. And almost from, and Gavin can confirm this, but almost from the day the wines were released, there was this brilliance, and I think this particular wine, I have such romantic attachment to this wine, and I'll get into that with wine and food pairing in a moment. But the reality is that this wine, there's a lot of Lewin about it, but there's also a lot of just the Margaret River, incredible power and intensity, without being heavy and cloying, which is a really interesting tightrope to walk.
Totally, yeah.
Because because you've got this powerful fruit, but that can support decent oak aging, but it's never heavy. And you used something strangely that I've always thought this wine is 100% key lime pie. That fruit is there,
Yep.
and the oakiness on the
Key lime
outside
pie.
of it is that sort of crust. And but it is, I think it is, well, it is one of Australia's great wines and one of the most awarded Chardonnays in the history of Australia, but also for good reason. It's not just every time I drink it, as we do as sommeliers with all these vaunted wines, you go, is this as good? Everyone says, and every time I drink it, it's like, yeah, damn it, it's really good.
Yes, it is. Well, speaking of being awarded, so in 2021, originally it was supposed to be hosted by Stephen Spurrier, but a colleague of mine, Angela Dewar from Cultured Vine here in Napa, and I hosted ultimately as a tribute to him, because it was originally this event called Judgment of Napa was supposed to take place in 2020, but COVID delayed it and delayed it. And then, of course, we got his diagnosis and he couldn't host the event, but he really wanted us to go forward with it. And the great master of wine, you know him well, Peter Marks, you know Peter, selected the wines. None of us knew what they were. And this was, instead of a Judgment of Paris tasting like took place in '76, where it was California versus France, this was California versus the world. And the Chardonnays in particular were not simply Napa Chardonnays.
Right.
We had some of the great Sonoma Coast, etc. And you see here what happened. There were two panels. One was collectors who paid a lot of money to come and taste them all blind. And you can see it's a small print there, but we had some extraordinary wines from Burgundy as well as from California. Lewin won the collector panel, but then it also won the professional panel. And this is masters of wine, journalists who all they do all the time is taste wine, rank it, rate it, and master sommeliers. And it was really one of those moments where we were all just kind of, wow, this is amazing. And I do want to say that these types of blind tastings, when you're tasting world-class wines, there's not a loser.
Right,
They're
right.
all amazing wines, but at the same time, they are, when a wine like this, or an American wine versus a French wine, when it can rise to the top, at least on the day, and already just even swims in the pool with those wines,
Right, yeah.
that's really something. So Mark was saying that you could talk about do you know when the first vintage of this wine was?
It was about 1980, I think.
Wow.
And going back into these competitions, this won the Decanter Wine Awards that year. And so it blitzed the Burgundians and everyone else there. And that really put Lewin on the map. And I guess he already talked about Dennis and the great Robert Mondavi going down. You know, Dennis was a beer drinking surfy who just had a farm, and he thought that if this great Robert Mondavi would pick this place to be one of the greatest Southern Hemisphere terroirs, he should try it himself. And so off he went. And you've got to remember, I'm a Perth guy. I'm from Margaret River. It's one of the most remote wine growing region in the world, basically. Okay, it's like 5-hour flight from Sydney. It's that's another 14 hours from here,
It's
where we
bucket
are.
list for me.
And it's a long way to go.
It's a long way
so
to go.
You got to make a bit of noise. If you're a Margaret River boy, you got to make a bit of noise out there, and that's what he tried to do. And Mondavi said to him way back, don't look to the east. Don't look to the classic South Australian guys for your your inspiration. He said, look to Burgundy, look to Bordeaux. So hence why he was going down those roads, and didn't really plant Shiraz till later on. But no, and since then it's become, it's obviously it's the benchmark Aussie Chardonnay, but it really sits up there in the world. And and the style's evolved. I think back in the day it was a little more richer and heavy. Now these days there's no malo in this one, for example. These days, it's still 100% barrel fermented and matured for nearly 2 years in oak. So it really sucks up the oak, but you still have that brightness of fruit. And I think that helps in those tastings.
Absolutely. No, I agree, especially versus Burgundian wines, because even though most of the time they go through that secondary fermentation or conversion where the malolactic acid is kind of is converted into a softer acid and kind of creams out the wine, those wines already have so much acidity.
That's right. Yeah.
With leaving it without the mallow, and Mark, you can weigh in on this, I think you're giving it that much more verve and spine and longevity. I've never tasted one that I was like, ooh, that's past its prime.
Right.
I kind of want to taste a really old one.
And it helps. This is the current release. 21 is the current release.
21.
They do hold it back a little bit, so
which is
it
also
needs that
really
time.
really cool.
And it's interesting. We got a few years ago, not to sort of support the Napa tasting. They did a Judgment of Paris tasting in Quebec a few years ago, and they said,
Cool.
"Oh, can you get some wines together?" And I did, and they then were quite annoyed because 5 of the top 7 Chardonnays were the Australians, and
Whoa.
this was the comment that we got back. Well, yes, but you put in all your best wines. I'm like, well, next time
Why would
remind
you
me
not?
to put the ordinary ones in because
Right.
so and Lewin was I think 1 or 2 in that one as well, along with Bindi and a few others. But I think it's testament to the fact that Australian Chardonnay, along with other parts of the world, but certainly Australian Chardonnay have since over the last 15 years or so, even if not a bit longer, they've just managed to figure out this idea of like big, rich, heavy, and oaky is not the path forward. Finding the cooler regions, the cooler sites within those regions, and playing around with the viticulture and the
Yeah.
winemaking, malolactic, blocking mallow, or just not necessarily running it through the way that was maybe traditional Burgundian sort of style. That's what's captured the imagination, and it's crazy how much good Chardonnay there is in Australia, and not just from Margaret River, although you would have to argue that that's the most awarded Chardonnay region in
Right.
Australia right now over the last.
Yeah, and
But
I,
there's
I think
Adelaide
you
Hills
would
and
probably
Tasmania,
say,
and
yeah, Adelaide Hills, Tasmania, and I think we're going to see more and more from some of those Victoria
yep, Yarra
sub-appellations,
Valley, and
which
yeah.
is super exciting. This is so delicious. I hate to move on from it, and before we do, quick lightning round. I'll start with you, Gavin. The most unusual or surprising food pairing you've ever had with that wine?
Well, it's not Moreton Bay bugs, which is which is
They
a
eat bugs in
Queensland.
Australia.
It's a Queensland. It sounds like
I
a
know.
bug, but
No,
it's
I
actually
know.
like a mini little crayfishy
It's
thing.
a little
but
crayfish
It goes
thing.
really well with it.
Oh, I forgot my popcorn. Hold
That's
on.
all right,
Oh,
but,
can you grab my popcorn? We have a roadie here. Actually, it's really just our mini
but I think
our
I've drunk
mini
this with
studio
everything under
audience.
the
But
sun.
this is mine, truffled popcorn. But all right, Mark, on to you. Most
Oh,
interesting
look,
or
it's
special
I'm not going
pairing?
to go weird and out of the box here, but I've done this now because I mean, even though I live in the Midwest right now, I lived in Vancouver for a long time, and I am a massive fan of West Coast seafood. Dungeness crab, no offense to other crab areas in the world, Dungeness crab to my mind is one of the greatest crabs, period. This particular wine, on so many occasions, I can't even begin to tell you, steamed crab, fresh lemon, and butter, all those 3 components,
Right.
is one of the greatest wine pairings I've ever had in my life. And if that doesn't do something to you when you have that combination, it's quite possible you're dead from the waist up. So
Fair enough. And that's interesting because you talk about the lemon and the drawn butter, and that's kind
all
of
of
what
it.
you're getting in the glass
You got to
without
have
the
all of
fat.
it.
Yay.
And I've done it with all
So,
my wine wanker friends, my MW friends, MS friends. We've done Mercer, we've done Polini Montrachet, we've done good California Chardonnays, all of which do really well. It's that particular wine, Margaret River Chardonnay, and
that
that particular
style.
wine that absolutely kills it. Yeah,
Did you
so
taste
good.
this? Okay, good. Sorry, I'm just making sure that all of our
We're all sharing the love.
studio audience gets to try it. All right, delicious, and I think you're 100% right. And if I can't do Dungeness crab, I would almost do anything that's a delicate
Yep.
seafood, but with that same approach. A good amount of butter and lemon, and boom, you're done. Super
I have
clean.
done it with alligator tail with my in-laws in
Alligator
Florida, which
tail.
is that's
Oh,
unusual.
But not crocodile tail, because that would be
Yeah,
Australia.
the crocs. We don't eat crocs
You
in
don't
Australia.
eat crocs,
They eat
yeah,
us.
yeah, not even. Okay, but alligator tail is really good. Actually, that's true. Okay, great. So let's jump into our reds, and this is another good excuse. We already talked about old vines a little bit with Chris in regards to Semillon, but of course the Shiraz is truly a signature of Australia, and it's also its own thing, right? As much as Syrah, the classic red grape from the Rhone Valley of France, is associated with that region, its iteration in Australia generally, but particularly in these very well, and this is McLaren Vale, sorry, this very well suited regions there's the experience is kind of very different and very special. So Gavin, I want to start with you and just talk about, this is Derenberg, which is a very special to my heart producer. I've known Chet Osborne for probably, I'm not going to say how long, long time.
Since I got here, we've all been kicking
A
around
long
together. I
time.
think 20 odd years ago.
We used to do events at the Aspen Food and Wine, and I've had some of their wines on Delta Airlines before. Really show beautifully, and they always have these fun names that give the flight attendants an excuse to talk about the wine to the guest,
absolutely.
and that's super fun. But this is the Dead Arm. We're going to explain why in the heck it's called that. But let's start out with Darrenberg. I know it's a multi-generation family that is really committed to wine after making some sacrifices to do it.
Yeah, well, fourth generation Chester that we know. He's like a shaggy-haired, loud-shirted guy, larger than life. And as he says,
he's the Sammy Hagar of Australia for me, but
he said winemaking should be serious until to the point where it gets in the bottle. Then it's all about fun. So he wants to get out and enjoy and show why we should be enjoying these wines, not just simply putting them in our cellar.
Right.
So it started in 1912 was when it first started. So it's one of the oldest wineries, existing family wineries in Australia. Makes a plethora of wines, but concentrating on the great McLaren Vale varieties. McLaren Vale is a coastal region. You could literally throw a stone into the Gulf of I've gone blank. What's it? Gulf of Vincent, Gulf St. Vincent. Beautiful white sandy beaches, but then you have these very diverse soils, very old. Australia's the oldest continent, so our soils are very old and leached, and you find different pockets of granite and basalt, but mean soil. So the vines really have to work. So these 100-year-old vines that we're sourcing these from, and it even goes into some of his more. So this is his flagship. This is more a $65, $70 wine, but some of his $20 offerings have those old vine material. And I think that's what really makes this wine stand out. Once vines get 50 years and above, and there's a whole classification we have, they really have learnt what to do with themselves. So and a lot of them are dry grown. They're bush vines, which you find normally in France as opposed to Australia and say here in California.
Right.
But, the Dead Arm, you mentioned the name. It comes from a fungal disease that affects old vines called Utapillata, and basically half the vine dies.
Yeah.
And normally, what you normally do is you rip them out and start again.
Start over.
But Chester and his father have for decades said that we get the most concentrated berries out of these vines, so we're going to keep them. And even though we're getting half a tonne per acre, we're going to keep going with them. So it's not very economically viable, but the wine you get is fantastic in the end.
Echoing Chris Tyrrell's thing about wines that the accountants do not love. Mark, talk about the taste profile of Australian Shiraz, this old vine style, and because it's so its own thing.
I'm going to jump in quickly though, because one thing that I do talk about in the book, because there's a gentleman, because in the past what we've talked about with old vines and do they make better, because I think we all love talking about old vines in Australia, but then the next question simply has to be, do they make better wines? And up until recently, it's been anecdotal. And in the book, I talk about this gentleman called Dylan Grigg, whose PhD was on old vines. And so in 2 short sentences, I'm going to ruin 4 years of his study. But the point is that what he has said is that now we've got some quantifiable evidence, and it's to do with epigenetic modification. I am not qualified to explain that. However, what he said that old vines for him at 50 years of age, which he did studies around Spain and all around the world with old vines, he said what they noticed is that old vines after 50 years, to his studies, would be able to bookmark weather events and set up for them in the future. So the point is that we now have this through epigenetic modification, and what he studied through that is be able to say, year in, year out, with all the vagaries of climate and whatever's going on, the fruit that will be delivered will be better quality than a young vine. Now, there's a winemaker involved, so presumably they don't screw it up in the meantime. So generally, we can say, old vines do make better wines, and it's not just anecdotal.
Not just anecdotal.
I think that's kind of cool. And what they talk about though, there's something in there, and I love that, because he said he's now off doing wine, making wine, and doing things. He said this is just the tip of the iceberg. But what they do talk about a little bit with old vines is that there's this quality of tannin that they talk about, a suppleness of tannin. There's a concentrated tannic thing, but without it ever being heavy and overbearing. And that seems to be a thing with Shiraz. And Shiraz is we're lucky in Australia, and this is one example of a multitude of 100-year-old vine sites in Australia. We have the largest collection of old vine material anywhere on the planet. It's not just with Shiraz, but certainly
No,
Shiraz.
and it's a huge
No one
commitment, and
comes
it's a
close.
real gift to the world of
Yep.
wine that Australians will do that. And that's something that's interesting because, especially being as new of a wine region, country relative to, let's say, Portugal or France or Italy, what have you, Greece, any number, to recognize the value of keeping that old vine material, it's hats off. It's thank you, thank you, thank you. Please set the tone. And I just want to say something about what you said, because what it shows you is how Mother Nature, when it comes to plants, we're not going to evolve as fast as we need to the world we're in. Plants get it. They're
Yep.
rooted in place, and they know they have to, and they're programmed to do it. So I think this research that you're talking about makes a ton of sense. I want to turn to the taste profile of this wine.
Yeah.
How do you? Well, I'll start with Gavin. How do you describe it? I'll give mine.
You know, it's unique. Chester, McLaren Vale, normally you expect you get these dark chocolate, you get the dark
I get the
fruits,
chocolate, yeah.
but Chester, he's a mad, passionate Barolo Burgundy lover. So he actually makes his wines maybe in a
elegant.
more elegant style than you expect. I think, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there's a generosity that you'll find in McLaren Vale that it's sort of more buoyant than, say, Barossa or Clare. It's sort of different. They're all three different profiles. But
Right.
I find you definitely get the dark sort of not quite plum but dark red fruits but then beautiful tannin structure here that just keeps pulling the wine back.
So you both have mentioned tannin, and I want to mention that as well, because for people who are watching, it really is kind of the signature for red wine. And those of us who follow it a lot and pay attention to different grapes and different winemaking styles, we really focus on tannin, and it's a texture more than anything. And I always try to tell people, think of it as almost like fabric. You can have silky, satiny tannins of Pinot Noir, and it's like silk or satin. Maybe the heaviest of tannins might be kind of, needing 20 years, and maybe they're close to sandpaper, but in between there, where we are here, it's with like suede or, chenille or spa robe, like something, there's a real nap and richness and plushness to it. So I would just, that's your homework assignment for all of you watching. Get a Pinot Noir, get a delicious Shiraz like this, and compare the two, just compare the tannin texture, and you're gonna realize this is so cool. And think about, texture is such a big deal. If we all ate baby food, we could take everything on this table and turn it into a strained baby food, and then it wouldn't be very good. Texture is so valuable. So Mark, taste profile from your perspective on this, how do you describe these wines?
Yeah, I don't actually have it in front of me now, but I certainly know Dead Arm really well. But I agree. Chester makes his wines a little slightly more austere style than typical McLaren Vale, but it's also, those wines tend to emerge a little bit later, like a bit of age with Chester's wines, I think are great. To me, there is that spice and that sort of profile that we associate, that peppery spice that we get with Shiraz in general in Australia. But I think McLaren Vale has this sort of blueberry fruit quality that I think is really when it's at its best, and I think that does come through here. But you want all that sort of that concentrated sort of tannin without it being heavy, and that blue fruit I think is really, really charming.
Yeah, that reminded me very much of when I was smelling it and tasting it. It was making me think of like cobblers that my grandmother used to make. They had wild blackberries, but they also had blueberries that were planted, and we would be able to harvest those. And nothing better than that straight off the plant, because she always put a little bit of like allspice or something in the crust. Okay, I'm always going back to things, smells and tastes, and textures for sure. Delicious, delicious wine. I really, really am so grateful that you brought it. And this is the 2018, so
yes.
we are, Mark, getting into a little bit of where it's resolving. It's kind of the acid and the tension are starting to melt together. So it's a really, but it's got a long way to go too.
Sure
and
has,
it's so
yeah.
cool that we now know that the
Gavin's spot on too. He drinks
I
a
don't
lot
know
of
one,
Barolo.
I think, over the Christmas break. So yeah, they was drinking really well. So they do age very well, these wines.
That's right. And I did get to go to a tasting at their office. Speaking of State Line Barbecue, which is a Napa Valley newbie that we are in love with, that goes really well with these wines. So we are going to wrap up with a spectacular and yet another inimitable Australian wine style, which is the sticky. And Australians love their dessert wines, that's for sure. And they call them stickies. What the heck is up with that? Just because that's like your sense of humor.
You talk about texture, and so we've spilled it on our hands sticky enough times at parties, and you see how sticky it is.
Yeah, it is
very
sticky
and treacly, and
yeah,
especially these grand old things. You know, this is we're going to have the Chambers musket now, right?
Yes,
yeah,
exactly, exactly. And so, actually, I need to jump this ahead so we can see the label. Oh, we can't see it very well because my little bottle shot was too small, and I couldn't figure out how to blow it up. My technical skills, but this is such a special wine, and it's a special style of wine. I specifically want to say that because there are dessert wines all over the world, and you can make dessert wine-ish out of Muscat that's sparkling. So probably a lot of you have tasted a sparkling Moscato at some point. This is its own particular variant of the Muscat grape. This is the Rutherglen region, and it is, which is in Victoria?
Yes,
right?
Victoria,
okay.
Very top of Victoria.
In Victoria, and it is a fortified wine. And I want to explain real quick what fortified means, right? So if you fortify a city, you build walls around it, right? You've all been to probably somewhere that was a walled-in city, but they were fortifying it against the enemy. If you fortify your breakfast cereal with 8 essential vitamins and minerals, you're increasing or strengthening the nutritional content. Here, when it comes to fortified wine, they're adding alcohol. So they're increasing the alcohol content, which gives it this incredible amount of longevity, but it also stops the fermentation of the grapes because the yeast can't function in that high level of alcohol, which this comes in at what, 18%? 18%.
Yeah,
so as opposed to, say, a Chardonnay from Napa Valley at 14. And the upshot of that is this incredibly luxuriant style that I call a Fig Newton in a glass, but I'm an American that grew up in the Midwest in the South. And do they have Fig Newtons? I'm going to ask you this, Mark, in Australia?
Sort of.
Sort of.
Sort of, yeah. Yeah, I got mostly introduced to Fig Newtons when I lived in Canada, and I used to do a lot of cycling. All my cycling mates used to carry Fig Newtons as their sort of boost for when they were cycling. But
cycling
it's not something we have a version.
Them.
We have a version in Australia that's
okay. Because when I grew up, there were commercials like you did the Fig Newton dance, and it was a whole thing, along with Ronald McDonald and all that.
We've led sheltered lives by comparison.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, all right. So the grape variety is Muscat is one of the most ancient grapes on the planet.
This is a brown Muscat.
A brown Muscat. So talk about. So first of all, let's go with Muscat. That comes arguably, I think, from the Mediterranean. I think some of the oldest variants of it are from
and they say, the Middle
Greece
East,
and the Middle East and so on. And then this one got to Australia, and it's a brown variant. Is it a mutation, or do we know?
Well, I'll take a step back. This is a happy accident, this whole wine, this whole program. It's like and Mark's probably going to agree with me, if you said to someone now in Australia, where would you go and plant vines? You probably wouldn't pick Rutherglen. It's like right on the banks of this big Murray River. It's very inland, very hot. But the reason we have grapes there, and Steve Chambers, who's probably watching this, and he's another fourth generation winemaker I represent here, would probably agree. It's like here in California, the gold rush.
Yeah.
The gold rush followed the same series. So that was our gold rush area. Back in the mid-1800s, we had these thirsty miners, entrepreneurial winemakers started planting vines and started making wine to supply the miners.
Right.
And what happened was, it's a very hot and intense.
Here.
Hot and intense. But these wineries sprung up around the banks of the Murray and in Rutherglen, and planting these vines, they like fortified wines in the days. They literally would fortify the wines, meaning adding alcohol to keep them stable, have them in barrels. A lot of people forgot about them. Up in they were in the hot areas in the rafters. And then
sounds like bourbon
decades they went back to it, found out, wow. So we are looking essentially at a modern day cellar system like they have in Spain. This is how all these wines are made. These are made there's a mother blend in, I've got you one of the other rare ones here, the Grand, which is from material that's 80 years old. Stephen has one called the Rare, which is over 100 years old. So it's parts of this cellar has wine that's over 80 years old, and you can try that. And that's, just what it does is, of course, it ramps up the intensity. When it's been that long in a barrel, the angel share, you've lost that through the natural evaporation. It's concentrated, and you've really lost what the natural. It's not what it was like when you first pick it. And Stephen does amazing tastings of freshly picked muscat, then what it looks like, and it is nothing like it, where it changes to become. So what you see here is more like a 15-year-old version.
It's so good, though.
Yeah, for $15, not bad.
That's what I was going to say. It just gives you so much complexity for people who think that at $15 or I think some of the most mass appeal wines are $15 now, and they're not talking to you. They're perfectly fine, but this is a wine that has a conversation.
And it still has
had.
the acidity, so it's clean. It's a clean finish. We're not talking about bubble gum.
That's true. It doesn't feel like you're drinking a milkshake or something. And you must taste it with chocolate.
Of course,
it's so good. Mark, so really quick, because we're going to wrap up. I'm running close to time. Take us through the levels and give people an idea of. So we just talked about what a great value this is, and then we also have the grand. Take us through the levels of Muscat.
There's the Rutherglen level, which I think is what you're tasting there, and then you've got the classic, grand, and rare, and each level that you go up, and it's a regulated system with the local producers in the region. And I've sat through the tasting, and it's quite a daunting tasting because they're very, 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 very sweet wines. But the reality is that the further you go up the scale, as Gavin mentioned, the older the material in there. But one of the critical pieces of this that I think defines this as a brilliant sweet wine is that you always get the muscatty, youthful freshness, because there's always going to be a little bit of young wine in there, no matter how far up you go. And I think that's what keeps that freshness there. You get the muscat, because the further you get away from it, when the wines get older, they become very sort of old wine, and they taste like where they've been for 80 years, which is in a barrel. They taste more like furniture and different other things. But there's always this freshness because there's just a little bit of the young wine in the older wines, and in this particular wine. And that's what I think makes them incredibly charming. And I think Gavin's point about $15, give me a break. You're getting a taste of Australian history. And it's and it's not a real American. It's not a real American dish, but sticky toffee pudding,
sticky toffee pudding. Yeah, we could do that. Absolutely.
That's
I was thinking. Do you know what just came to my mind too was banana pudding. If any of you with the Nilla wafers, kind of getting close. But
Nilla wafers. Did you say Nilla wafers?
I did. I said Nilla wafers.
Strangely.
Guilty pleasure. So that is, and I want to ask you this because I think I'm correct, that once the bottle's open, it's not going to tank on you the way a Chardonnay will or whatever.
This is a stable wine. It's not. This is not actually aging in the glass in the bottle so much. It's a finished wine once it's put in there, so it just sits there happily.
So you can open it and have an ounce and a half or like that perfect dessert portion, either with dessert or as dessert. My mentor Kevin Zraeli would be like, "Well, I'm not going to put anything with this," but which is true.
For a couple of months, easy.
For a couple of months, so that's important for people. Yeah, so we're all in agreement that you're not, and then if you do spend the money on the big boy, girl, big one, big kahuna, you are not going to be so worried about it going bad on you. And I think that's a really wonderful thing. It kind of takes me to like Tawny Port from Portugal is that way. And that's a real gift. But we're going to wrap up here soon. I'm going to taste it with my aged cheese because I think that's going to be absolutely killer. Have you ever had a pairing with this wine? You mentioned treacle pudding. Anything that anybody should check out that we haven't talked about on these wines?
I don't know what Mark was saying, but I mean, you could eat, just nuts and dried fruits. It's just a great, because it's got all those elements already, so it's just a natural match, and it all plays off each other. So it's a great way to finish it.
Yeah. Mark?
Yeah, and I'm a bit like you, Andrew. I like contrast, even though I think sticky date pudding is almost like too much of the sugar thing can be a bit overwhelming, but it does work. It works like a charm. But cheeses, man, I think there's so many cheeses that this would work with.
Right?
You could pull it into the blue cheese area if you wanted to.
Oh,
Certainly
blue
those
cheese.
firmer mountain cheeses,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Comte and Beaufort, or
Mm-hmm.
yeah, there's and just a good old sort of cloth bound cheddar.
Oh, right?
I live in the Midwest, and I love Wisconsin cheddar. I'm a big fan.
Go
So
cheeseheads. Exactly. Well, I will
exactly.
just say we've got truffled popcorn here, and that's working really well too because the salt is just like totally
Yep.
doing the yin yang with the
Contrast.
sweetness, which is really nice.
And it has been dribbled over vanilla ice cream at my
Oh,
house before.
dribbled over
I think
vanilla
you make your own rum and raisin if you like.
Okay, here we go without all the hassle. Oh my gosh, what a great idea. Fantastic. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. This has been such a fun show. I think you've seen that there are extraordinary things to be celebrated and explored with Australia, and none of these wines is cheap. None of them are crazy expensive, and especially for what you get. And if you want to have a cellar where you can drink the wine now, but you can also put a couple of bottles or a case or whatever aside if you've got the space, you can know that it's going to get better. And I don't mean better than it is now, more different, right? I'm sure I was fine in high school, but I'm just different now, and I have more to say, and you do too,
Yes, I
and
do.
you do too,
More,
Mark.
more,
So
more complex and interesting. That's my argument.
more complex and interesting, and yeah, so you can have a longer conversation with a lot more nuance to it. So this is a real special thing about these particular wines of Australia, and I think, look, there's a lot of more mass brands on the market that I think have gotten us distracted away from what Australia
Good point,
really has
yeah,
to offer. And we're still not talking about like enormous trade ups of cost. So to me, that's an exciting thing. So I'm super excited about and grateful for this book because he's got the wines you need to be paying attention to right now in Australia, and many of these are there. There's many more, and this is not something where you're opening up a book about XYZ wine region
get
and
hold of, yeah.
and you can't afford it. So I want to raise a glass to all of you, and then I'm going to quickly cheers to all of our friends in
Thank you.
Australia, and a Godspeed to everyone facing what we're facing right now with fires. And like we said before, our Australian friends have been through that a bunch, and as we have here. But I will talk quickly about the next show because I think a lot of us are curious about this. I'm calling it What the Facts because we're going to talk about what's going on with all the messaging around wine and health. And I'm not an
Right.
expert. We're just going to focus on kind of what the questions are and where the messaging is because it's conflicting and conflicted and confusing. So we'll talk about that a little bit. We will obviously taste wine and explore some wines along the way, but I hope you'll join. And if you happen to be an expert in that field and you want to weigh in and provide additional information, I have become quite the student of the topic. And what we all know, of course, is that the grandma rule, right? Everything in moderation, everything in balance, and we're all good to go. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Mark, wonderful to have you. Gavin, thank you so much. Thank you for the great wines. And
Pleasure to
cheers
be
to
here.
you all. Really, really appreciate everyone joining, and we will see you next month. It's the 26th because I need a little bit of time to get back from France and Wine Paris. But